The sentence that turned palaces into graves. There was no courtroom, no execution platform, just one whisper from the emperor, and a woman's world went dark. Stand in the Forbidden City at the height of the Ming Dynasty, and you would see perfection. Golden rooftops rising like waves of sunlight, marble bridges polished by ceremony, silk rustling through corridors scented with incense and power. To the outside world, this was the center of civilization, the throne room of heaven's chosen ruler. But hidden inside this engineered beauty was a punishment so calculated, so psychologically precise, that even death seemed merciful by comparison. They called it the Cold Palace, and it did not need chains to destroy you. The Cold Palace was not a building. That is the first misunderstanding. There was no iron gate engraved with warning signs, no official plaque, no guards announcing your sentence. The horror of it was far subtler. One moment you were a concubine of rank, trained in etiquette, wrapped in silk, attended by servants who knelt at your feet. The next, without trial, without explanation, your name was removed from the Imperial register. Your title vanished. Your monthly allowance disappeared. Your coal for winter was withheld. Your candles were taken. Your servants reassigned. The emperor did not even need to look at you when the order was given. A single word was enough. And then something even more terrifying happened. Nothing. No one argued. No one protested. No one asked questions. Because inside the Forbidden City, the emperor's silence was law. If he chose to forget you, the entire empire followed his example. Your chamber, whether it stood in a distant, eastern courtyard or behind a crumbling wall near the Imperial gardens, became the Cold Palace the moment the decree was spoken. Geography meant nothing. Power meant everything. Imagine what that meant for the women inside those walls. Concubines were not raised to survive alone. From adolescence, they were trained to exist within a system of ritual dependency. They did not cook their meals. They did not sew their garments. They did not even light their own lamps. Everything from water to warmth flowed through palace hierarchy. When that hierarchy was removed, it was like cutting oxygen from a flame. You were left breathing in shadow. Winter in Beijing is merciless. Temperatures plunge below freezing for months. Coal was rationed strictly by rank. An empress received abundance. A favored consort received comfort. A woman with no title received nothing. In the Cold Palace, frost formed along interior walls. Silk was replaced with coarse cotton. Fingers cracked from cold. Breath turned to mist in rooms without fire. And no one came to ask if you were warm enough. But the physical suffering was only the surface. The true cruelty was isolation. Doors locked from the outside. Food passed through narrow openings. Orders given to servants forbidding conversation. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the pale light shifting across stone floors. No letters. No news of family. No knowledge of whether the emperor who banished you still ruled or had already been replaced. Time stopped, but the world beyond continued without you. And that uncertainty created a climate of permanent fear, because every concubine understood the mathematics of her survival. Favor was not love. It was proximity to power. A jealous rival's whisper could undo years of careful obedience. A single political shift could turn yesterday's honored consort into tomorrow's erased woman. The Cold Palace was not simply punishment. It was a warning to everyone else. Inside the most powerful court on earth, women learned a brutal truth. Execution ends suffering. Oblivion stretches it across decades. And this system did not exist for a single emperor or a single dynasty. It endured for over 2,000 years, refined generation after generation, because it worked. It eliminated scandal. It avoided public bloodshed. It made inconvenient women disappear without creating martyrs. But some stories refused to vanish. Some women endured long enough for history to remember them. And what happened to them was far worse than silence. The science of breaking a human spirit, no chains, no torture chambers, no public executions, just silence, hunger, and time. The cold palace did not kill quickly. It dismantled you slowly. The brilliance of the cold palace was not its brutality, but its restraint. Empires understood something long before modern psychology would give it language. The fastest way to destroy a person is not through violence, but through isolation. Within the Forbidden City's vast geometry of courtyards and corridors, the cold palace functioned as a laboratory of deprivation. It stripped away identity piece by piece until the woman inside no longer recognized herself. There were no dramatic punishments to stir sympathy, no visible scars to provoke outrage. Instead, there was absence of warmth, of sound, of acknowledgement. The process began with erasure. A concubine's name, once carefully inked into palace registries, was quietly crossed out. Without rank, she had no allocation of rice, no coal allowance, no lamp oil, no incense, no medical visits. The imperial household operated like a precise machine. Remove one cog and it stopped turning. A woman banished to the cold palace was not attacked. She was disconnected. And disconnection inside an enclosed court was a death sentence drawn in slow motion. Servants played a crucial role in this system. In theory, one attendant might remain assigned to the disgraced woman. In reality, that attendant was often someone already punished for their own failures, resentful eunuchs or maids sent to the most undesirable post in the palace. They understood a dangerous truth. A woman in the cold palace had no protector. No one monitored treatment. No one punished cruelty toward her. So small acts of neglect multiplied. Food arrived late or spoiled. Water was withheld. Clothing went unrepaired. Rooms went uncleaned for weeks until dampness crept into bedding and mold bloomed along walls. The empire did not need to issue violent commands. It relied on indifference. Winter was the empire's silent accomplice. Northern Chinese winters cut through bone. Coal was distributed by rank with mathematical precision. When your rank vanished, so did your heat. Historical accounts describe women wrapping themselves in thin bedding, breathing frost in rooms without fire, their fingers numbing until they could barely hold a bowl. In summer, those same neglected chambers became humid traps. Mosquitoes bred in stagnant water. Infections festered. Fever went untreated because physicians served only those with status. If a woman recovered, it was by accident. If she died, her body was removed at night, and her name quietly struck from another ledger. Yet the deepest wound was psychological. The cold palace offered no timeline, no sentence length, no appeal. You were there until the emperor changed his mind, and emperors rarely admitted error. A woman banished at 20 might still be there at 60, staring at the same cracked wall. She did not know if her parents lived or died. She did not know if her son, if she had one, remembered her face. She did not know what year it was. The outside world continued in triumph and disaster while she remained suspended in an endless present. Over time, behavior changed. Records across dynasties describe the same patterns. Women counting bricks obsessively, pacing identical routes until grooves formed in stone floors, speaking to imagined visitors, laughing at empty air. Some stopped eating, not from rebellion, but because their sense of self had dissolved. The palace scribes documented these declines with bureaucratic calm, as though noting maintenance issues in a building rather than the collapse of a human mind. This was the cold palace's true design. It created no martyrs. It produced no public outrage. It generated only silence. And silence is easier to manage than blood. But occasionally, silence cracked. And when it did, what emerged from behind those sealed doors was not weakness. It was something far more dangerous. The courtyard they sealed shut two of the most powerful women in the empire. One rising rival who understood patience better than mercy, and a prison built not for punishment, but for humiliation. The year was 655 A.D., during the Tang Dynasty, an era often remembered for poetry, cosmopolitan culture, and imperial brilliance. Yet behind that celebrated golden age unfolded one of the most chilling cold palace episodes ever recorded. At the center stood three women: Empress Wang, dignified and legitimate; Consort Xiao, radiant and fiercely competitive; and Wu Zixin, a former concubine who had learned something more valuable than beauty timing. In the Forbidden City, survival was never about love. It was about proximity to power. And Wu understood that better than anyone. Empress Wang had ruled beside Emperor Gaozong with ceremonial grace. Consort Zhao held the emperor's affection, competing daily for his attention. Their rivalry was old, bitter, and public. But while they exhausted themselves battling each other, Wu Zixin positioned herself as something far more dangerous, the reasonable alternative. She whispered carefully placed doubts into the emperor's ear. She observed alliances. She waited for weakness. And when both women were politically exposed, she struck with precision. The charge was conspiracy, poison, treason against the throne. Few at court believed it. Many recognized the accusation as political theater. But in a palace where the emperor's word defined truth, disbelief was irrelevant. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were stripped of their titles and banished. Yet this was not the ordinary cold palace of mold and neglect. This was engineered degradation. Historical texts such as the Zizi Tongjian describe what happened next with chilling restraint. The two women were confined within a courtyard. The walls were reinforced. The doors were bricked over. A single hole was left in the stone barely wide enough to pass food through. That hole became their only connection to the world they once ruled. Imagine the psychological cruelty. Two rivals who had spent years undermining one another now trapped together in a sealed enclosure, stripped of rank, status, and dignity, forced to share the same confined air. There were no beds recorded, no servants assigned, no ceremony of imprisonment. They lived in the same space where they slept and relieved themselves. Time did not move forward. It thickened. Days bled into one another as imperial life continued just beyond the wall. They could likely hear distant court music, the echo of ceremonial drums, the movement of silk through corridors they would never walk again. Power had not merely discarded them. It had enclosed them. At one point, Emperor Gaozong reportedly visited the sealed courtyard. Whether out of guilt or curiosity, history does not say. When he called their names, both women wept. They did not demand restoration. They did not ask for revenge. They asked to see the sky again, to rename their prison the courtyard of reflection, as if humility might soften stone. The emperor hesitated. He said he would consider it. Wu Zixin did not hesitate. Within hours, the emperor's wavering compassion was neutralized. Accounts state the women were beaten brutally. Then, in one of the most infamous passages in Tang records, they were mutilated and placed into large wine vessels. The texts grow deliberately vague at that point, as though language itself recoiled. Whether embellished by later historians hostile to Wu's reign is debated. But the fact that such a story was considered believable speaks volumes. Emperor Gaozong did nothing. He did not intervene. He did not reverse the order. He did not confront the woman consolidating power beside him. Because inside the Forbidden City, power did not tolerate sentiment. To challenge, it was to risk joining the women already sealed behind. Brick and silence, the cold palace was never about correction. It was about control. And Wu Zixin had just proven that even emperors could be spectators inside their own empire. Asterisk. The mother the empire chose to forget. She gave the dynasty its firstborn son. She secured the future of the throne. And for that, she was locked away for nearly 3 decades. In the late 16th century, under the rule of the Wanli emperor, the cold palace reached a level of cruelty so deliberate it felt personal. Her name was Consort Gong, though history remembers her more for what was done to her than for the title she once carried. She had entered the Forbidden City not as a noble bride, but as a palace maid, a teenager assigned to serve in the quarters of the Empress Dowager. She scrubbed floors, folded bedding, and learned quickly that inside those red walls, invisibility was survival. Then one afternoon, the emperor noticed her. What followed was not romance. It was power exercised without consequence. Weeks later, she was pregnant. The pregnancy created a problem. The emperor did not love her. His affection belonged to another woman, a favored consort of noble birth, whose son he desperately wished to see inherit the throne. But imperial records were meticulous. Eunuchs logged every imperial visit. Dates, times, chambers. When the Empress Dowager confronted her son with evidence, denial was impossible. Tradition demanded recognition. A child was acknowledged. The maid became Consort Gong, and the emperor never forgave her for it. She gave birth to a son, the emperor's firstborn. By centuries of Confucian law and dynastic precedent, that boy was the rightful heir. In any other court, she would have been honored. Instead, she became an obstacle. The emperor's heart and political ambitions were fixed elsewhere. So he chose a punishment far more calculated than execution. He erased her. Consort Gong was sent to the Palace of Great Brilliance, an isolated compound in the northeastern corner of the Forbidden City. Its name sounded radiant. Its reality was suffocating. Her stipend was cut. Her servants dismissed. Coal was withheld during Beijing's freezing winters. Water was rationed in summer heat. Most cruelly, her son was forbidden from visiting her. The future of the Ming Dynasty grew up separated from the woman who had brought him into the world. For 27 years, she lived this way. Imagine the psychological torment. She knew her son existed somewhere within the same vast complex of walls and courtyards. She knew court officials argued endlessly about naming him crown prince, a debate that consumed imperial politics for nearly 2 decades as the emperor resisted tradition. She knew she was central to a succession crisis that shaped the future of the empire. And yet, she sat alone in a darkened room, her eyesight gradually failing from constant tears and lack of light, reduced from imperial consort to forgotten shadow. Servants loyal to the emperor's favored consort reportedly worsened her suffering. Deliveries arrived late. Food was meager. Coal sometimes did not arrive at all. There were no public punishments, no dramatic accusations, just sustained deprivation. The empire she had secured with her womb pretended she did not exist. In 1611, after nearly 3 decades in isolation, Consort Gong collapsed. She was dying. Her final request was heartbreakingly simple: to see her son. At first, even that was denied. Historical accounts describe the crown prince kneeling outside his mother's locked quarters, begging eunuchs for entry. Hours passed. Finally, permission was granted. He entered to find a blind woman reaching for his sleeve. She could not see his face, the bearing of the man he had become, or the robes of his rank. But she felt the silk beneath her fingers and whispered her final recorded words: "To feel you grown. Now I may die without regret." She died that night at 46 years old, having spent more than half her life in enforced solitude. The Ming Dynasty would remember her son as emperor, But it almost forgot the woman who made him possible. And the cold palace claimed another victory, not through violence, but through time. Starved between the walls, she was carrying imperial blood. She was locked in a corridor open to the sky, and the official record reduced her death to one line dot by the time the Ming Dynasty reached its later years. The cold palace had evolved beyond neglected chambers and sealed courtyards. It became something even more experimental punishment, shaped by political convenience. One of the most chilling examples is the fate of Consort Yu, a young concubine whose only crime was becoming pregnant at the wrong moment. The emperor on the throne was weak, easily influenced, and surrounded by power brokers who understood that heirs were not blessings, they were threats. In the Forbidden City, a pregnancy could shift alliances overnight. And when influence was at stake, mercy evaporated. Consort Yu had once lived in silk-lined quarters like any other imperial woman. She had learned court etiquette, memorized rituals, and mastered the art of appearing invisible when required. But invisibility vanishes the moment an emperor's child begins to grow beneath your ribs. To some within the palace, that unborn life represented instability. A new heir meant a new center of gravity. For those who profited from controlling succession, this was unacceptable. Rumors were seeded quietly. Accusations circulated in whispers. The emperor, guided by advisors whose power depended on his confusion, turned against her. The sentence was swift and without spectacle. She was stripped of title and banished not to a sealed chamber, but to what palace records called the Sandwich, a narrow corridor wedged between the inner and outer palace walls. It was open to the sky above, but enclosed on both sides by stone so high it blocked most sunlight. There was no roof to shield her from rain, no insulation from winter wind, no privacy. It was not even a room. It was an architectural afterthought, repurposed as a prison. She was confined there while still pregnant. Imagine standing in a space barely wide enough to stretch your arms, exposed to the elements, knowing that the child inside you might one day sit on the dragon throne. Days passed without proper food. Historical accounts from the Ming court do not dramatize what happened next. They record it with brutal simplicity. She was denied sustenance. She starved. And she died before giving birth. The official entry in the records reads with devastating indifference. A corpse and 2 lives. There is something uniquely horrifying about that phrasing. No mourning. No investigation. No scandal. Just arithmetic. 1 woman erased. 1 unborn heir extinguished. The cold palace did not need spectacle. It relied on normalization. If cruelty becomes routine, it no longer shocks. It simply continues. The corridor where she died was not hidden underground. It stood within the same palace complex where imperial ceremonies unfolded with choreographed splendor. While ministers debated reforms and generals planned campaigns, a pregnant woman weakened between stone walls, her existence reduced to inconvenience. The empire that prided itself on cosmic harmony could not accommodate her survival. What makes this story unbearable is not just the starvation. It is the calculation behind it. No official execution order was necessary. No formal charge was written. Deprivation did the work quietly. By the time her body was removed, most likely, after dark, the political problem had solved itself. The cold palace had once again proven its efficiency. It left no martyr, no public outrage, no immediate rebellion. It left only silence and a single line in a ledger. But silence, when studied closely, can be louder than confession. And the next woman to enter the cold palace would refuse to fade quietly at all. Asterisk, the concubine who refused to be silent. She smuggled cameras into the Forbidden City. She whispered reform into an emperor's ear. And the cold palace was waiting for her. By the late 19th century, The Qing dynasty was no longer the unshakable giant it once appeared to be. Foreign powers pressed at China's borders, internal corruption rotted the bureaucracy, and reform simmered beneath the surface of imperial ritual. Into this fragile world stepped Consort Zhen, remembered in some accounts as the Pearl Concubine, a young woman who did something far more dangerous than disobedience. She thought independently. She entered the Forbidden City at 13, selected as a consort to the Guangxu Emperor. Unlike many before her, she did not shrink into the quiet choreography expected of palace women. She learned photography, a foreign technology viewed with suspicion by conservative elites. She dressed with subtle defiance. She encouraged the emperor to question entrenched authority, particularly the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi, who ruled from behind a silk screen with unmatched political instinct. Consort Zhen did not merely exist within the palace hierarchy. She tested its limits. The Guangxu Emperor listened to her. That was the problem. In 1898, inspired by reformist officials and emboldened by voices like Jin's, the emperor launched what became known as the 100 Days Reform, a rapid attempt to modernize governance, education, and military structures. It threatened decades of carefully maintained control. For Empress Dowager Cixi, reform was not evolution. It was destabilization. Within months, she executed a coup. The emperor was placed under house arrest on an island within the Imperial lake, effectively imprisoned in his own palace. Consort Zhen's punishment followed swiftly. She was banished to the Cold Palace, confined to a small structure in the northeastern section of the Forbidden City, 3 neglected chambers beyond the Jinki Pavilion. The door was locked from the outside. A single window remained unbarred, just wide enough to pass a tray of food and a basin of water. That was her world reduced to geometry. 4 walls, 1 opening, absolute surveillance. The woman who once photographed imperial life now lived unseen. Yet even confinement could not fully erase her presence. Servants whispered of her resilience. Officials recalled her intelligence. Unlike many women broken by isolation, Zhen represented something new, the collision between tradition and modernity. Her imprisonment was not merely personal. It symbolized a dynasty resisting its own transformation. Then came 1900. Foreign armies advanced on Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. As chaos approached the capital, Empress Dowager Cixi prepared to flee. A decision was made regarding Consort Zhen. According to most historical accounts, she was ordered thrown into a palace well before the imperial court abandoned the city. Official explanations later claimed it was to prevent her capture by foreign troops. Others believe it was simpler. She remained inconvenient. The image endures an intelligent young woman, confined for her influence, silenced permanently in the shadows of the same palace she once tried to reform. When her body was recovered after the court returned, the event was handled with ceremonial restraint. No open condemnation, no public reckoning. Just another chapter folded into imperial narrative. The Cold Palace had evolved across centuries, from sealed courtyards to starved corridors to locked chambers. It adapted to the needs of each dynasty, always serving the same purpose: control without spectacle, power without accountability, erasure without noise. And here's the final truth that lingers long after the gates of the Forbidden City close at dusk. The Cold Palace was never about individual guilt. It was about maintaining the illusion of infallibility. An emperor could not be wrong. A dynasty could not admit weakness. So inconvenient women were removed from sight until history forgot to ask about them. But history did not forget entirely. It left fragments, records, wells, sealed walls, whispered names. The Cold Palace stands today not as a single ruin, but as a warning carved into imperial memory. When power fears influence, it chooses silence over justice. And silence when weaponized, can outlast any throne.